So how do you feel after all these years, seeing, and all that you've done, seeing what's happened to our country?
Is that
Yes, to
me?
To you, Professor Chomsky, first.
I've had more years. Well, actually, it's pretty bad, but we should recognize that it's not really all that new. Go back to the modern conception of international law was pretty well founded right after the Second World War. The Nuremberg Tribunal, Charter of the United Nations, and so on. So what was the position of the United States then? Well, the United States was instrumental in setting up the World Court, the International Court of Justice, but at once the United States declared that it is not subject to any charges based on international treaties, meaning the UN Charter, the Charter of the Organization of American States, or others. And in fact, that actually came to the court. It came to the court during the Reagan years when the government of Nicaragua brought charges against the United States for essentially war against Nicaragua, or international terrorism, if you want to lower the charge. The Nicaraguan case was presented by a distinguished Harvard Law School professor. Most of it was thrown out. And it was thrown out because the case appealed to the core principles of modern international law, UN Charter, OAS, and so on. So in fact, when the case was finally judged, it was restricted to very narrow grounds, a bilateral U.S.-Nicaraguan treaty and what's called common international law, what's generally understood. Even on that narrow basis, the U.S. was accused of unlawful use of force, which means terrorism in lay language, and ordered to pay substantial reparations. Well, how did the bipartisan Congress react? By increasing aid to the Contras, increasing the actions just condemned as criminal. Meanwhile, the New York Times, for example, dismissed the court as a hostile forum, a proof that it's a hostile and therefore insignificant hostile forum because it made charges against the U.S. A couple of years earlier, the same Times and other commentators were praising the court because it supported the U.S. in a charge against Iran. Well, that's, in fact, the United States went on to veto, I think, 2 Security Council resolutions which called on all states to observe international law. Well, all of that passed with virtually no comment. Almost nobody knows about this, except maybe some specialists. And it goes beyond. In 1948, the United Nations passed a condemnation of genocide, major crime. 40 years later, the United States ratified it, but with a reservation, inapplicable to the United States. And that came to the courts too. A couple of years later, Yugoslavia brought charges against NATO for bombing. And among the charges was a reference to genocide. The United States representative appealed to the court and said that the United States would withdraw from the proceedings because the United States was formally entitled to commit genocide, which is true, by this reservation. And the court accepted that correctly. The court rules are that they can't bring anyone to trial unless they agree to the proceedings. So the United States was excluded from the charges. The rest of the NATO powers weren't. That was reported, but with no comment. If we declare that we're entitled to carry out genocide, fine, then we're entitled to carry out genocide. Now these things are pretty deep. I mean, it's perfectly true that Bush broke, let's take even the torture charges. If you look carefully, it's not so clear that Bush was in serious violation of U.S. law when they carried out torture at Guantanamo or at Abu Ghraib, because the U.S. never really signed the Torture Convention. it was rewritten by the Senate to exclude certain categories of torture. And if you look at those categories, they are the categories that the CIA carries out. The CIA back in the 50s, basing themselves on KGB manuals and so on, redefined torture to allow what's called mental torture, the kind that doesn't leave marks. So for example, actually even waterboarding. Take Bradley Manning and solitary confinement, which is of course torture by any reasonable means, but not by US law. That was then signed into legislation under Clinton. So what's called torture here is a very narrow category, and a good deal of the torture that the U.S. carries out is actually legal under U.S. law. Well, this is discussed by specialists in constitutional law, Sanford Levinson and others, but almost nobody knows about it. Well, these are things everyone ought to know about.